Long before vampires were romanticized in novels and films, they were genuinely feared. Across Eastern Europe and even parts of New England, communities were gripped by panic, convinced that the dead were rising from their graves to feed on the living. This wasn't just folklore. It led to real exhumations, ritual mutilations of corpses, and in some cases, trials of the dead. The vampire scare wasn't just a product of superstition, it was deeply tied to disease, death, and the limits of scientific understanding in the pre-modern world. The vampire panic first took hold in Eastern Europe in the early 18th century, particularly in regions like Serbia, Hungary, and parts of Balkans. Stories began circulating of people dying shortly after a recently deceased villager had been buried. The symptoms were vague: fatigue, fever, wasting away, but terrifying. Villagers believed the dead were returning to drain the life of their family members. In many cases, entire communities would demand the body be exhumed. What they found only fed their fears. Corpses were reported to look unnaturally preserved. Some appeared bloated, with blood at the mouth, or with fingernails and hair that seemed to have grown after death. To 21st century eyes, these signs were easily explained by natural decomposition, but to people at the time, they were undeniable proof that the dead had risen. These reports caught the attention of both local officials and curious Western observers. The Austrian Empire, which governed parts of these regions, even sent military surgeons to investigate. In one famous case from 1725, a man in Serbia was believed to have returned from the grave after several villagers died mysteriously. His corpse was exhumed, found to be fresh and blood-stained, and a stake was driven through his heart. According to records, it gave a terrible scream before decaying rapidly. While likely exaggerated, these accounts were taken seriously enough to be recorded by government officials and later reprinted across Europe. They became some of the earliest vampire cases documented in Western literature. The panic spread with astonishing speed. By the 1730s, newspapers in Germany, France, and even England were reporting on vampire incidents in Eastern Europe. Writers and scholars began debating whether vampires were real. Some dismissed it as rural ignorance, while others insisted it was a matter worth scientific investigation. Voltaire, ever the skeptic, mocked the reports but acknowledged their popularity, noting how strange it was that otherwise modern societies were still enthralled by tales of the undead. Interestingly, this wasn't just a phenomenon of the poor, uneducated villages. The fear of vampires was widespread enough to cross class boundaries. Wealthy landowners and local priests sometimes supported exhumations, even performed the rituals themselves. These rituals were often brutal. Corpses were staked, decapitated, or burned. In many regions, iron rods were driven through the heart or mouth. Garlic, holy water, and religious icons were used to protect the living. These acts were not symbolic. They were desperate attempts to end what people believed was a literal threat. While Eastern Europe is often the focus, similar fears appeared elsewhere, particularly in the 19th century New England. One of the most famous cases took place in Rhode Island in 1892. A young woman named Mercy Brown died of tuberculosis, which was then called consumption. When other family members started to feel ill, locals grew suspicious. They believed Mercy was somehow responsible, acting from beyond the grave. Her body was exhumed and found to be relatively well preserved, likely because it had been stored in a cold crypt. Her heart was removed and burned, and the ashes were mixed into a tonic and given to her sick brother. Despite the ritual, he died shortly afterward. The Mercy Brown case became one of the most famous examples of an American vampire panic. At the heart of these scares was fear of disease. In both Europe and America, the vampire myth became a way to explain illnesses people didn't understand. Tuberculosis was particularly terrifying. It moved slowly, wasting its victims away while leaving their minds sharp. It often spread through families, one member after another, just as vampire legends described. With no knowledge of bacteria or how diseases were transmitted, people blamed the most visible explanation: the dead. The vampire scare eventually faded as medical science advanced. Germ theory, better sanitation, and modern medicine replaced folklore with facts. But the fear never completely vanished. It evolved. By the late 19th century, writers like Bram Stoker transformed the vampire from a peasant fear into gothic fiction. Dracula wasn't a rotting corpse from a village cemetery. He was an aristocrat, mysterious and alluring, who haunted Victorian drawing rooms rather than Balkan farms. The myth had been reshaped for a new audience, but it still carried the same themes of death, desire, and the fear of what we can't control. What makes the vampire scare so compelling is how it reveals the human need for explanation. Faced with suffering and mystery, people turn to what they knew: stories, rituals, and shared beliefs. And while we may view their actions as extreme or irrational, they were responding to real grief, real fear, and real death. They just didn't have the tools to understand it the way that we do now. The vampire scare is a reminder that history is not just about kings, wars, or inventions. It's about the anxieties that lie beneath the surface, the things people whisper about in the dark. And sometimes, those whispers led entire communities to dig up graves in the hope of putting their nightmares to rest. Like, comment, and subscribe for daily history and culture content.